Good afternoon, and welcome to CabWriter Comprehensive 3, Part 11. This is the final part, and today what we're going to do is we're going to create a layout drawing that has all of the scenes that you see in this model. And once they're in layout and scaled appropriately, we're going to hatch them in layout, and then you will be ready to label, dimension, or anything else you want to do in your layout drawing. That will give you a professional set of layout drawings for your model. The other thing we're going to do is create production documentation. But before we do, there's a couple of things I want to go over. First of all, when we left off in Part 10, there were some scenes that weren't completed. I've now completed them. So you can see the original 10 are here from the ladder base back. In Part 10 we added the north elevation, the north section, and we added some things down here. I think we added the breakfast elevation, breakfast section, and the peninsula plan, this one. But you can see I've added a bunch more. For instance, for all of the walls, I've added a elevation and section scene. So in addition to the north elevation and north section, you'll see an east. How about that? Incorrectly spelled. Let's make that EAST. And you'll see an east section, a south elevation, south section, southwest elevation, southwest section, so on and so forth. I've also added, in addition to the breakfast section, I've added the baking section. This is the baking view. If I go back, this is the view of this baking section. So the baking elevation and the baking section I added. I also added the island plan. This is the plan view for the island. And we added the peninsula plan view back in Part 10. The other thing I did was I renamed this model from CabWriter Comprehensive 3 Part whatever to Gracie Hopkins Kitchen, because this is the final drawing. And since I did that, I also changed the project name to Gracie Hopkins Kitchen. The interesting thing about that is that name will be used in layout, and I'll show you later. So those were the changes I made. And this is the drawing. Oh, the other changes I made is Notice these are now northwest perspective, northeast perspective, southeast perspective, southwest perspective. And I reordered them just a little bit. So I just renamed these, and that was that. So before we get started with our layout drawing, there's one other thing I wanted to mention. In part 10, recall that I had made some fixes. Most notably, I fixed the door and draw. Let me bring it up here. The door and draw fronts, remember, had the wrong materials, and I used the extended entity info to correct those. So if I bring up the extended entity info, and if I look at this door right here, notice it said sheet good MDF. But watch this. If I instead select this door and say retrieve the cabinet defaults, and I look at materials, well, that's not a good example. Oh, yes, a better example is down here. Let me bring up the notice the materials in here. It's got that A1 type of material. But if you look at the extended entity info for that, we corrected it to be sheet good MDF. So here's the warning. When you fix, when you're sloppy at the beginning and you don't set up your materials in your CabWriter settings, and you end up doing what I did, which was fixing that mistake by using extended entity info, you're going to be fine unless at that point you go and redraw a cabinet. If I were to redraw this cabinet right now, it would use this information again to set up the extended entity info or the attributes for all of the parts in that cabinet. And then if I forgot to go to correct them, then I'd have to do it all over again. So the fortunate thing is that the extended entity info attributes are what's used for our cut list. And so everything will be correct, fixing it the way we did, unless we go back and redraw this cabinet, in which case it might use the attributes, or it might use the CabWriter settings that are saved in this cabinet's DNA, and then change the attributes back to the original incorrect materials. So that's just a note of warning. All right, now we're ready to get started. And we have a choice. We can either create our layout drawings first, or we can create our production documentation. And it doesn't matter much which we do. The arguments for one versus the other is if we're going to cut things on a CNC machine and we want to get that process started, we might want to do the production documentation first. Send out the DXF files to our vendor or on our own machine and get it started. And while we're doing that, we could be doing our layout drawings. On the other hand, if you want to make sure all of the drawings are done and correct and any mistakes are fixed, then you probably want to hold off on the production documentation. And that's what we're going to do here. We instead are going to start with creating the layout drawings. Now, creating the layout drawings is pretty easy. If we go to the File menu and we look at CabWriter to Layout, we have a bunch of things we're supposed to do. And by the way, these are in the order you should do them. In other words, this first, this last, this second to last, and if you have to make any changes to an individual scene, then this second to last, and this third to last. But this is the order you should do them. And we've already done this one. We did that in part 10 where we assigned the hatches. Remember this. We did that in part 10. So that's done. We also created sections from section planes. That's what all of the scenes were about. And now what we're going to do is choose a layout document and set it up correctly for what it is we want to do. That's this dialog box. First thing I want to do is choose a paper type. Well, I'm going to choose Architectural D 24 by 36 inch. I've got some other choices I can make here. I'm going to use this one because that's a fairly good sized drawing. And this is a fairly large model. And the other reason is because I only have templates for this. I'm going to create my drawings in the landscape view, so I'll choose landscape. I have two templates. One is Nisaw, which is Greg Larson's New England School of Architectural Woodworking, and one is CabWriter. Well, CabWriter is a ripoff of Nisaw with just the logo changed and my name in there instead of Greg's. So I'm going to use CabWriter. This, when you see the template, which I'll show you later, just tells CabWriter what parts of the template it can't use. On the left side, it can't use the first inch. On the top, it can't use the first inch. On the right, it can't use the first 7 inches. And on the bottom, the first 2.5. And you'll see why later. I'm going to use a line weight of 0.4 points. That's pretty typical, and it shows up nicely on an Architectural D drawing. And then I'm going to use a default model scale of 1 to 10. This means if I took a ruler on my Architectural D drawings and I measured something that was 1 inch, it is actually 10 inches in the model. So if my cabinet is 20 inches wide, it would appear as 2 inches on my drawings. So that's a ratio of 1 to 10. And that's what I'm going to use. That turns out to be a good starting point. So I'll say OK. Now, if I go to CabWriter to Layout, I've set up my layout documentation. And now I'm ready to send my scenes, all of them, to layout. Now I don't have to create a layout document. When I send the scenes to layout, it's going to create the layout document for me. It's going to use this name. Well, actually, I think it's going to use this name for the layout file. So whatever this name of this file is, it'll be the same name with an extension of .layout. So let's do that. CabWriter to Layout, send scenes to layout. Send scenes, notice the plural. It's going to take all of these scenes and send them to layout. It'll ask me if I want to save my model, and I'll say yes. Now I've got to be patient. won't take too long, but we must be patient. I want to wait here just so you have a sense of how long something like this takes. It's going to send about 28 scenes, I think, to lay out. Should be just any moment now. There you go. It's going to open the layout application. Okay. Now, remember in the setup where we had 4 numbers. 1 inch on the left, 1 inch on the top, 2.5 inches on the bottom, and 7 inches on the right. And the reason for that is because on the right here, we have general notes, material legend, and things like that, and our logo. And on this 24 by 36 inch sheet of paper, this actually takes about 7 inches. So we're just telling CabWriter that it can't use that. Similarly, here, this is about 2.5 inches that CabWriter can't use. Here 1 and here 1. So that's what that was all about. In this particular model, I didn't follow this hatch legend. I used different hatches. So you will, for instance, pre-finished maple plywood may or may not have this. Maple plywood A1 VC, we don't have any of. So this legend may not be right for this model. In fact, it won't be right for this model. But when you're doing yours, you want to make sure that whatever template you're using or whatever hatch legend is on it is what you use when you assign hatches in your model. This first page is simply a new page. If you want to put something on if you want to add a page to your drawing, you can do that by just putting something on this, renaming it, and then moving it to the position you want. But I'm going to delete it. This is slow. There we go. All right, so we deleted that, and now we're looking at our northwest perspective. That was the first scene. And there's 4 of them. This is the last one. So you have 4 perspective scenes, and those will be your first 4 drawings. Now, as far as shop drawings are concerned, you probably don't need the cut list scene. You probably want to get rid of that drawing. You may want it for some reason, I'm not sure what. It's used in SketchUp so that we know what gets put on the cut list. But in the actual drawing set for shop drawings, probably not needed. The same with DXF, probably not needed. And certainly the purchase parts, it's not needed. So these 3 you might want to get rid of. The next one is the base plan. Now notice the base plan is not hatched yet. There's no hatching here. None of these plans are hatched at the moment. There's the upper plan. And this is our ladder plan. And this is the north elevation. And the north section. None of this is hatched. But what we'll probably want to do at this point, what we must do at this point, because recovering from it later is really difficult. Now the scale of 1 to 10 seems to work pretty well for everything I've done up to this point. This is a scale of 1 to 10. How do I know that? Well, I can select this, look over here in the SketchUp model, and see my scale is 1 to 10. My next one isn't going to be so nice. I probably want to scale that up. So the way I do that is simple. I select it. I go over here to my scale, and instead of 1 to 10, I'm going to choose 1 to 6. See what that looks like. That looks much better. So I'll just leave that alone now. And I'm likely going to need the same scale for the east section. So I'll select that. I'll come over here and select 1 to 6. And I have to do that for all of my, and I'm not going to do this online, but I have to do that for all of these scenes, or they're called pages now. Each scene is a page in layout. But I'll get down here to the peninsula, and this one probably needs to be a little bigger yet. That probably needs a scale of 1 to 4. That's better. By the way, you can make your own custom scales. See down here it says add custom scale. What I would do if I were you, I would create a 1 to 1, 1 to 2, 1 to 3, 1 to 4, all the way up to 1 to 10. That seems to work well, so that, you know, here instead of 1 to 4, we might want it 1 to 3. That might work better. So giving yourself a lot of scales to work with is a good thing. So offline, what I'll do is I will create the correct scale for each of these pages, and then what I'm going to do is close and save and close layout, because the next step requires that layout be closed. And the next step is going to be moving the hatches over. Now the reason I have to set up the scales appropriately to send the hatches over is that the hatch is nothing but a group, a two-dimensional group. And it has to be scaled appropriately when we add it to the drawing. So if we have the wrong scale and we want to change it later, then the hatch group won't scale with it. So get your scales right. For each of these pages, make sure you get the scale right. Then save your drawing and close it before you do the next part. Now I'm going to do all this offline, and I'll come back and show you how to move the hatches over. Okay, I'm back, and I've fixed up all of the scales. I'll just show you a couple down here. The island plan, I made that 1 to 4. You can see that up here. And baking elevation, baking section, those are 1 to 4 as well. Now if I had a 1 to 3, that might even be better, but I don't have that right now, and I'm not going to create it. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to save this. Well, let me go back to my first northwest perspective, and I'm going to save it. And I'll close it. which brings me back to here. And now I'm ready to go to File, CabWriter to Layout. Turns out I don't have to edit any of my scenes. But if I had to edit one of these scenes, I'd probably want to go back to Send Selected Scene. In other words, I would select the scene that I've just edited and use Send Selected Scene to Layout. And then save it and close Layout. Come back here. And now I'm going to say, and it's very important that Layout be closed. Now I'm going to say Hatch Scenes in Layout. This will take a little while. We'll wait and be patient. And so let's go to what we expect to be hatched. Let's go to the base plan. Lo and behold, it's hatched, as is every other page. They're all hatched. And so that's it. Now you are ready to begin dimensioning and labeling and noting in any way you want your drawings, and you will save them when you're done. I'm going to save this right now. I'm not going to do that online. Layout is, you know, it's like SketchUp. You have to learn it. There are some resources that I'll point out in a second that are pretty good for learning layout. I'm not going to spend time here teaching layout, but you have, just to mention, you have dimensioning tools that you put dimensions down with, very much like in SketchUp. Labeling tools. You got some nice little icons over here that you can drag and drop here anywhere you want. These are meant to show section cuts and tell you which cut it is and what page it's on. I'll show you a little bit of this in a finished drawing. And this is, you know, just an ellipse that where you can put the cabinet numbers on where you want them. And this is kind of a northeast, west, south compass that you can put on here and rotate so that you have a good idea what, you know, on your plan views or something like this. For instance, well, I'll show you that in a moment. In fact, let me go to the layout drawing that we started with in part 1. Okay, here we are in with the layout drawing that I did back in part 1, and I actually dimensioned it so you could see some of these things. But notice I'm zooming up here. This tells me that's cabinet 19, that's cabinet 7. This is cabinet 1. Cabinet 1 is a 3-box cabinet. And cabinet 2 is also a 3-box cabinet. I've got the dimensions on here. This tells me this is section cut 1 for this drawing. And I can find it on page 11, which is the north elevation. It's looking at the north elevation. So if I go to page 11, I should expect to see the elevation view of the north wall. And lo and behold, if I look down here, that's what page 11 is. This one, for instance, is my 6th cut on this page. But to see it, I can go to 21. Well, 21, I can tell, is the baking elevation. So this is the baking center right here, And so, lo and behold, that's the baking elevation. This is the compass. And that's pointing north, and that's my north wall. This is kind of artificial in this Gracie Hopkins kitchen, because I laid it out with this being true north. Notice, by the way, that this comes from the project name, Gracie Hopkins Kitchen. It's telling me it's the base plan, that I drew it. The scale is as noted. Well, here's the note. Base plan, scale, 1 to 10. There is a little scale symbol that you can drag and drop on here. Okay, so that's it. We've created the layout drawings. And so I'm going to close this and save it. In fact, I'll close both of them. And now what we're going to do is create our production documentation. Recall a while back in this video, I mentioned we had a choice to make. And that is whether to produce the layout drawings first or the production documentation. I chose to produce the layout documents first and the production documentation second. And that wasn't a good choice. I made a mistake. But I'm not in bad company. Before I use a number of quotes from Albert Einstein to Joan Collins. And they've got a theme. And the theme is essentially that if your goal is to avoid mistakes, or if you've never made mistakes, you've never really accomplished anything or tried anything new. Well, I make plenty of mistakes. Mistakes are part of the learning process. And my gift to you is that I've made mistakes that will help in your learning process. So without further ado, let's move along and see what those mistakes are. And I'll tell you how to fix them. I'm not going to fix them in this video. That would take too much time. But I will tell you how to fix them. And hopefully you will learn a lot from that and not repeat them. Okay, so the first thing we want to do in creating the production drawings is go to the File menu and choose CabWriter Production Documentation. That will bring up a little dialog box that's going to remind you that this is a process that could take a while. And it's going to warn you that if your outliner dialog box is open, please close it before proceeding. It can double the computational time. Actually double or triple or even more. And so I'm going to check right now, make sure I don't have it open. And lo and behold, I do. So I'm going to close that outliner dialog box. So the other dialog box that comes up after I close that little warning is the production documentation dialog box. I'm going to create files with a comma separated value delimiter. That's the most common. In some parts of the country, people use commas for decimal points, and so you may, in that case, want to use a different delimiter. All right, in the scenes used in reports. Remember, my purchase part scenes are only going to include the draw boxes. And so I'm going to put that scene I'm going to use for my door and draw report, although it's only going to have the draw boxes in the report. The cut list is going to have I'm going to use the Cutlass scene for the cut list reports. And I can choose, by the way, any of these scenes for any of these reports. But the way we made these scenes, it makes sense for me to choose the cut list scene. For the DXF report, I'm going to choose the DXF scene. Now the cut list scene has almost everything in it. It doesn't have the draw boxes because those are other items. The DXF scene is going to include the draw fronts, door fronts, and the base boxes because those are all going to be cut on the CNC machine. So I include them in the DXF scene for my DXF report. If I were going to make my doors and drawers or buy them from a third party, I might want to oversize them a tad. If I buy them from a third party, I might end up shaving the edges a little bit just to make sure I'm satisfied with the construction. So you might want to make them bigger by a 32nd of an inch or something and take them down with a hand plane. But I'm going to put nothing here for the moment. And I'm going to choose draw fronts in my report, draw boxes, doors, spreadsheet compatible cut list. This spreadsheet can be either Microsoft Excel, Open Office, or whatever accepts comma separated value input. My DXFs, I'm going to produce 2 of them. Actually, I won't even produce this one. Yes, I will. I'll produce the capability for it. I'll explain that later. But I'm going to produce DXF reports by material name and thickness. And I'll produce DXF reports by individual component. And you'll see why later. By the way, over on the right side of this production documentation dialog box is the ability to print labels. Now, for instance, if I'm going to cut a bunch of parts on the DXF machine, I might want labels that I can take and put on each of the parts so I know what they are. At the moment, we support Avery 5160 labels. And those labels are about large enough to get 5 lines of print on them. And you can choose the 5 lines of print here. And here are the choices you can choose. So in this case, I've chosen component number, the description of the component, and the description of the component is the component name, the material name, the finished dimensions, and tags. Now, in some cases, we're going to put some notes in the tags field. You might also want to include the initial dimensions. For instance, I could choose here resize dimensions and then final dimensions or finished dimensions. And you'll notice there is a difference here for this part right here. The finished dimension is 30 and 61/64. The resized dimension is 31 and 13/64. So whatever it is you want here, you can choose, set it up, get it from whatever is listed in the DXF report. In other words, the DXF scene. It'll look at all the parts on the DXF scene, get this information, and create a label for every part. Actually, for every instance, you'll get a label for every instance. So if some parts have 2 instances, you'll get 2 labels. Let's just preview it. When it actually prints it out, it will print it out as 3 columns I believe, yeah, 3 by 10 rows, I think. This is 1 of 2. That's 2 of 2. So you'll see if you have more than, if you have components that have more than one instance, you'll get enough labels for every instance or every part. All right, but that's not what we really want to deal with here. I can print the label simply by hitting print. I can close the preview with this button here. But what we're interested in right now is this side of the dialog box. So now I'm going to create my reports. Now this is going to take a while. And notice that if I click somewhere in the white space, I'll get this little blue circle on PCs at least that tell me things are busy. It's going to take quite a while. And I think I'm going to let it run and waste a little time on the video because it's important for you to understand that this just might, you might want to go away and get a cup of coffee and come back. This one I think is going to take close to a minute and a half, something like that. So we have to be patient. My machine, I believe, is a 12-core Pentium, and if you could look at the progress bars, you would see that they're in full use. And my fan is going like crazy trying to keep the microprocessor cool. Again, I'm wasting this time because I want you to have a feel for how long it might take. This is a pretty big project. Shouldn't be much longer now. Yep, I probably should have gotten a cup of coffee. Okay, so it's finished. And it says all production documents have been placed in a directory. And this is the directory. And that's something you might want to, if you don't remember where it is, that's something you might want to write down. But in my case, it's part 11. It's in a folder, CabWriter 3 videos, part 11, Gracie Hopkins Kitchen. So I know where that is. I'm not going to write that down, but I say okay. And I'll bring that up. Here it is, here. So put them all in this folder because this is where the Gracie Hopkins skip file is, right there. And it's in that part 11 folder, which is the part we're in right now. This is a backup for this Gracie Hopkins kitchen. This is the layout file we've created. And here's all of the production documentation. This is a .cwx file. If you double click on this, it'll open up a third-party application called Cutlass Plus FX. We're going to do that. It's a very nice application. It doesn't come with SketchUp or CabWriter. It's a third-party application, but it's a very handy application. We're going to look at this a lot. You can get the same information as this CWX file in a spreadsheet, and that's this file. This is a CSV spreadsheet file, so you can open it up in Microsoft Excel, Mac numbers or OpenOffice or whatever. This is another CSV file, which is the door and draw report. In here is all my DXF files. Now, I've got DXF files in three distinct formats. One is individual parts. Now, if I look at that, the individual parts are broken out by the material type and thickness. So if I look at my 3/4 inch maple plywood pre-finished, every single part that's going to be put on 3/4 inch pre-finished plywood is here. There's an individual DXF file for each part. The reason for that is there's a number of there's a number of CNC machines or third-party vendors who might cut your plywood for you that want things in this format, DXFs for individual parts. So we produce that for those people who might want that. This is the format right here that would be used by Cutlass Plus FX. It's similar, but it doesn't break them down by the type of material and thickness. This is just a list of every single part in. And you can see by looking at the number of files, there's 359 items, which means there's 359 parts in this CabWriter project because there's one file per part. The one that we're going to look at today is this integrated DXF files. What that is there's a file for each type and thickness of material. And within that, within this 3/4 inch maple plywood pre-finished DXF are all the parts in that one file instead of separate files for each part. They're all within that one file. That's the one we're going to look at today. But let's go back now. I'm going to look at the cut list using the Cutlass Plus FX.cwx file. This is the third-party application, but it's really nice to look at and it helps you diagnose things. So let's look at it. Here you can see the part number for each part. So for instance, if I were to sort this by part number, which I can do by just clicking on this heading and go to the top, starts out with Cabinet 1. Every different component in Cabinet 1 has its own individual number. So C11. Now, by the way it sorts these is it starts out with C11, C110, 11, 12, all the way up to C2, C2, 20, 21, all the way up to C3, C1, 32, 33. It doesn't do a great job of sorting, but you get the idea. This is the subassembly. So if I sort by subassembly, and I go to the top, I have some parts that don't have a subassembly, which is interesting. That's a problem. And we might want to investigate why that is. And I'm not sure why right at the moment, but we'll figure it out. And so this sorts the subassembly. So for instance, C1L box 1. This is all the box 1 parts. C1L box 2. This is all the box 2 parts. C1L box 3. The box 3 parts, so on and so forth. And I can sort by any column here that I wish. Now, the other thing I might want to look at is other items. In the other items, you'll find all of the draw boxes right here. you'll find some other things that aren't labeled with the subassembly. And those are the countertops. Those are other items that don't have a subassembly. They're going to be purchased externally, so no subassembly. But all the draw boxes are here. In the door and draw report, these will be listed as box 1, box 2, box 3, box 4, and you can see that here. Draw box 4, draw box 4. Now, if these are both draw box 4, that means they have the same dimensions. And so you'll order a certain quantity of draw box 4 from your third party. And this will tell you which cabinet they belong to. The really interesting thing about this report is the layouts, optimizing the layouts. So we'll go to the Layouts tab. And it's optimizing the layouts. And notice I got a warning sign. It says one or more parts could not be placed on a layout diagram in the bill of materials. And it says see skipped list. Well, it's easier than that. I can say OK and go back to my parts list. And I'll notice that some of them have this orange line, highlighted with an orange line. And those are problem parts. So I'm going to look at them one at a time. All right, so I can look at this and right off the bat notice really something strange there. It says the thickness is 21/32, and it's calling for sheet good shop plywood. Well, I don't have 21/32 shop plywood. So that's what it's complaining about. There's no material to make this from. But it's actually indicating a problem in the drawing. And let's go to the drawing and see what the problem is. I'm going to clear all layers and just bring up, I'll just bring up my ladder base. And I'm going to look with this tool right here, which you can download from our website. It's part of the Construction Plus tool. But with this little tool, I can pick any part and it'll tell me its dimensions. So I'm going to pick this part right here. And I'm going to look at its dimensions. Its thickness is approximately 21/32. Its width is 3.5, and its length is approximately 15 7/8. The length, I can understand it being an approximate measurement because it's a result of a hypotenuse of a triangle. So that's not surprising. But this piece of material should be 3/4 of an inch thick. And it's not. It's approximately 21/32. So what that is was a drawing or modeling mistake on my part. Remember, this is the cabinet that we started off as one type of cabinet, and then we modified it for this angle here. And I created these parts manually. And when I did, I made a mistake. Instead of making this piece of wood 3/4 an inch thick, I apparently made it 21/32. So that's the first problem. The way I would fix it, I'd go back to my model, make this the correct thickness, and having done that, I will have to fix up a number of things. For instance, the hatch for this part will now be different. So I'd have to create any place where it shows up in the hatch. I'd have to recreate those hatches and those scenes, which means I'd also have to correct them in layout. Not a big deal, but it takes time. So that's problem number 1. Let's go back and see problem number 2. All right, now this one. This one. It says maple plywood A1 MDF core. Well, first of all, I don't have any of that raw material in my raw materials list. So let me go to maple plywood, and it's 13/16. So I have no such thing in my material sheet goods. Notice maple plywood A1 MDF core. I don't have anything. So it can't produce the layout for that. But the bigger problem is this shouldn't be maple plywood A1 MDF core. Remember I corrected all the door and drawer fronts to get rid of A1? Well, what happened was this cabinet, when I modified it over here, it originally started out with 2 doors that were much like this. If I look at those doors and I look down here, notice that C8LD1, C8LD1, because they're both the same size and they're exactly the same component, just 2 instances of that. This started out with both of these being the same size and both being the same component, but when I resized it for this angle here, I had originally forgot to do something. I had originally called this C12LD1, and I had originally called this C12LD1 right door. Now the component names are definitely different. This is the left door, and this is the right door. But CabWriter requires that you don't have the same D prefix or D well, you don't have 2 doors with both D1 at the end of their prefix if they're different components. If they're different components, they have to have different D numbers. So I had to change this from D1 to D2. And the way I did that was I used the Make CabWriter Component tool. I couldn't do it with the extended entity info because if I change the part name, the component name of a component using this tool, I lose all of its attributes. So I had to change it with this tool. And when I did that, it restored the original material information, the incorrect material information. So what I want is if I bring up the extended entity info, I want this to be sheet good MDF. This should be sheet good MDF. So I should change it to sheet good MDF. In which case, it would have been fine. In my cut list. But this is the something I should have done before I produced the cut list. So that was mistake number 2. Mistake number 3. Notice these two. Look at the length. 117 inches. We don't have plywood large enough for that. If we were using 5 by 10 sheets of plywood, this would work. But if I look up sheet good shop plywood, it's 48 inches by 96 inches. So it can't place those parts. Let's look at what they are. And let me take that tool here again, get component dimensions. And look at this. Look down here. Notice the length is 117 inches. And that's true of this one here too. The length is 117 inches. So the way I would fix this, first of all, I'd do a couple of things. One is I'd put some more support here by copying these and moving them down here. And then I would cut this in half someplace. Probably somewheres where I could make a good connection, like right there. So I could fix the model up to do that. I might have to create some new parts, and I might have to do it using the Make CabWriter component tool, but I'd fix up the model. Once I've changed that, I've got a number of things I have to change, like the ladder base view itself. That has to be fixed up, and the hatches will change, as will the these views in the layout drawing. So again, I've got some patching up to do. Not a big deal, but it's work. It's just another one of these things we want to be careful of, that we haven't created any parts that are too long for our plywood. So let's go back and see what else we have. This is an interesting one. You look at this and say, gee, what's the problem here? That's a back, 1/2-inch plywood, 49, 30, sheet good, maple plywood pre-finished. Looks like there's nothing really wrong here. Except notice what it did. Look at the length. The length is less than the width. Why is that? Well, CabWriter corrected for grain direction. Apparently the grain wants to run in this direction, the 30-inch direction. It's a back, so the grain direction of a back of a cabinet wants to be along the blue axis. Well, apparently this cabinet is wider than it is tall. And so the grain direction wants to be the 30-inch direction. The cross grain direction wants to be the 49-inch direction. But we only have 48-inch plywood in the 49-inch in this direction. In the non-grain direction, the cross grain direction. So it can't place that part. Let's look at it. Okay, this is the base boxes. And the problem is this part right here. Notice its length. With this tool, the length says 49 inches. But CabWriter knows we want the grain to go in this direction. And the grain direction is always the length, so that when we lay it out on the plywood, the grain runs in the long direction. So the way I can fix this, there's a couple. I can either make this cabinet smaller by moving this stile over and making my sink bigger. I think that's the sink. But probably the easiest way to do it is I've got to get it under 48 inches, which means I've got to get it below, I've got to remove at least 1 inch and 1/32. What I would do, notice this cabinet is a corner cabinet that goes into the end here. I would make this 2 inches shorter and have it just come to here. It's not going to lose much of the cabinet, and it'll solve this problem. So I would just redraw this cabinet, and I would change the parameter about how far back into this corner this goes. So that would fix that last problem. Now again, I would have to change the number of drawings. What does this tell us? The conclusion I draw from this is don't start doing your layout drawings until you've produced your component, your production documentation. Do your production documentation first. Find these problems, make changes in the model, and then you wouldn't have to fix up all of the problems that you might find in the cut list. In fact, what you might do is even before you create scenes, even before you create the scenes in the model, you might run production reports and just see if there are any problems and fix them at that point, because it's much easier to fix them when all you've got is no scenes and just the model. And any problems you might have, you can fix then do your scenes, then do your production reports again, and then do your layout drawings. That's the order that this set of mistakes indicates we ought to take. So it's a learning process. I've learned. So let's move along. All right, so this is, I'm going to ignore these mistakes and look at the layouts. Let me go to my maple plywood pre-finished 3/4 inch. That's how I would do that here. I'd select maple plywood pre-finished 3/4 inch. And over here is a little drawing of all of the sheets of plywood I need. Looks like 24 of them. And you can see how they're optimized. And you can look at any one of them. Let me look at this one. And you can see there's not much waste. The other thing is this Cutlass Plus FX allows you to optimize based on how you want to make your initial cuts. In this case, it's optimized for vertical cuts. In other words, cutting here, then here. You can see that better in some of these others. Notice, cut here, then cut here, then cut here, then cut here. This is optimized like for a panel saw. You can also optimize them in the other direction so that you'll get a rip cut here, a rip cut here, a rip cut here. So you can choose which way you want it to optimize. But it does a pretty good job of optimizing the sheets of plywood so you don't get much waste. Okay, but this cost, I think this version of it costs $250 or $260. And there's another version that costs about $500. You don't need the $500 version, but this one is a really nice version. Okay, so let's get rid of that. And I want to go back and look at this. This is the same cut list, but it's a cut list produced that's a comma separated value that you can look at in almost anything, including OpenOffice, which is what this is. OpenOffice is free. and it's just a spreadsheet. And in the spreadsheet, you can sort by columns. It's a little harder with the spreadsheet, but you can sort by columns like you can in the other application. This groups all of the rough lumber here. This is all rough lumber. Then the sheet goods. This is all sheet goods. And then the other parts. So you have your draw boxes here and also the countertops. Now, notice there's a couple of columns we want to look at here in the sheet goods. Notice this column here. And sometimes you'll see a W, sometimes a WL, sometimes a T. Oh no, not on sheet goods you won't see a T probably. On hardwood you will. But what they're telling you is that this has been resized. Those that are blank have not been resized. So you can count on their initial cuts. Initial thickness, initial width, initial length will be the same as the finished thickness, finished width, and finished length. And here you can see that. 30 5/8, 30 5/8, 12 5/16, 12 5/16, 3/4, and 3/4 right there. But on some of them, for instance, like this, it says both the width and length have been resized. Well, let's look at that. The width, in this case, starts out at 22 3/16, and in the end, it's 21 15/16. The length starts out at 15 15/16, and it ends up 15 11/16. So that's what that column's trying to tell you. These three columns here, decimal thickness, decimal width, decimal length, is exactly what you would think they are. They're the finished thicknesses and width and lengths. And that's so you can create equations in your spreadsheet that might calculate things like board feet, total numbers of sheets, things like that. Okay, let's close this. And let's go to our door and draw report. So this gives us a report of all the slab doors. This is the door. It tells you which door it is. The material is MDF. The width, height, and thickness, and the quantity of each you need. This is the draw fronts. Same sort of information. It also tells you how many sliders you need based on the depth of the cabinets. Notice here, we need 22 pairs of Blum sliders with this part number, because almost all the draws are base draws. We only have 3. Let's see. Oh, yes, no, we have 6. We have 6 draws up top in the upper cabinets. The upper cabinets are very shallow, so we need a different slider that's much shorter, and we need 6 pairs. So it tells us the Blum sliders we need based on the cabinet depth. And then it tells us the boxes we need. The overall height, the overall depth, and the overall quantity and width. And it gives them names, box 1, box 2, so on and so forth. Now some of the boxes will need more quantities. For instance, this is 6 boxes that we need here. Those are those small boxes. They have the shallow depth that are in the 2 wine cabinets, the upper wine cabinets. There's 3 in each cabinet. So As I showed you in the Cutlass Plus FX diagram, you can relate the draw box number to the actual draws. The last thing I want to show you, I'm going to open up an application, also a third-party application, that you might want to use if you're going to cut material on CNC machines. And the one we like is Cut2D Pro by Vectric. V-E-C, right here, V-E-C-T-R-I-C. And so I'm going to demonstrate again just the 3/4 inch maple plywood pre-finished material. I'm going to create a new file. It's going to have plywood that is 96 inches wide. Now, wide in this dimension means along the x-axis. And 48 inches high. In this case, it means along the y-axis. And it's 3/4 inch thick. So I say OK. And now I want to import vectors. Well, vectors meaning DXF files. So I'm going to go to my Part 11 Gracie Hopkins Kitchen. Gracie Hopkins Kitchen integrated DXF files. And I'm going to look at the 3/4 inch maple plywood pre-finished. So I'll open it. Take a second. Okay, so when I first open it, all the parts are laid out in a line. And they're 100 inches apart to allow for a 96 inch sheet of plywood and 4 inches of spacing. They're just laid out in a line. I can look at any one of them. And you can see, it tells me the part and gives you the shape. Whole bunch of them. Now I'm going to tell it to nest those parts. And it's going to take a little while. I think there's 300 and some parts. So we'll be patient, as we always are. Plenty of opportunities for a cup of coffee. And I'll preview them. This too would take a while. It's creating the drawings. It's a 2-pass operation. We need faster machines. They never seem to be fast enough. That's one pass. The second pass is much faster. And there we are. I'll just now notice it requires 24 sheets of plywood, much like the other one told us it required 24 sheets of plywood. And I can look at each of these sheets. But in other words, if I choose this one, for instance, notice down here it's in white. I can blow it up. Let's choose something like, I don't know, this one right here. Let's blow it up. Okay, you can see all the shelf holes. And what these are, by the way, these are tenons. And why you have this double line is because it has to actually cut and clean up the tenon back here. So we need a line for the bit to follow. Similarly here, these are going to be pockets, and the bit will go inside the pocket and follow the line around. But this is the optimized layout. You notice it makes pretty good use of space. If you have this kind of a bottom, it can stick something else in here, and it does a really nice job. And so you can go from here, and it'll produce another set of DXFs which has all of this optimization that can then go to your third-party CAD application to create all the G-code for your CNC machine. So I just wanted to show you that. Now, there's another problem that I want to point out, and let's see if I can find it. This might be it. Yes, this is it. Okay, in the wine cabinets, there are a bunch of shelves. They're narrow and deep. They're only like 3 or 4 inches wide, and they're like 12 inches deep. These are actually tongues. But unlike this one, which is the bottom of a cabinet, and here's a tongue, you don't see that here. And why is that? Well, it's because we made a mistake. Another mistake. Let me show you what this one is. And I'm going to turn on X-ray. Okay, now look at the bottom of this. Notice the bottom has also a tongue and groove. The tongue actually starts on the top side of the bottom, and it doesn't go all the way to the bottom. So if I wanted to cut this on a CNC machine, I'd probably want to look at the outside face, and that would tell me that I have to cut some of this tongue out, half of the material for the tongue. If I want to cut the tops on the CNC machine, notice the tongue now is on the bottom, unlike the bottom, which was on the top. And so I'd want to look at the outside edge face again to make sure that I cut this out. Let's look at the shelves. In the shelves, the tongue is on the bottom. So if I wanted to cut this out, I'd want to look at the top side of this shelf. Well, how do I know to tell the DXF, how to create DXF files that do that? Well, I look at CNC setup. Here is the CNC milling faces. So if I look at the sides, it says always look at the inside of the sides. In other words, the inside of a box to figure out what to do with that side. And that will pick up not only the construction holes, which go all the way through, but it'll pick up the shelf holes that only go halfway through. If I told it to look at the outside of the side, it would only pick up the construction holes, and it would miss the shelf holes. So the tops and stretchers, it says look at the outside. And sure enough, that's what we wanted. This top, we wanted to look at the outside face. That would pick up the fact that it has to remove material for this tongue. The bottom, it says look at the outside face. Now the bottom's just the opposite of the top, but the way we pick it up is, again, we look at the outside face. And by looking at the outside face, we pick up the fact that we have to remove that material. And let me go to the back. We say, look at the outside face for the back. Well, if we look at the outside face for the back, sure enough, we'll pick up the fact that we have to remove the material for this tongue. And custom parts, you have to choose how you want to look at custom parts. Left, right, front, back, top, bottom. Default is left. Now remember, these are CabWriter settings, and every single cabinet can have its own set of settings. So what I should have done for this cabinet is I should have set for fixed shelves, I should have set this to top so that it would look at the top of this to see that it had to remove the material for this tongue. But I didn't. I left it on bottom. Bottom's the incorrect position for that fixed shelf. So because I'm looking at the wrong face, the only thing it's going to see here is, when it looks at the bottom, is just the outline of the board. And sure enough, that's what we see here. Just the outline of the board and not the fact that it's a tongue and we'd have to cut that material out for the tongue. So that's another problem you have to be careful of. And I can only warn you to check your DXF files very closely. Otherwise, what you're going to end up doing is, in the shop, you're going to have to put these on a table saw and cut those. You know, cut a rabbet there for to remove that material. It's not a big deal. You can cut them pretty quickly on a table saw, but since you're paying for CNC machines, you know, you'd like to have done this correctly from the start and make sure you didn't have this problem. Okay, now that's all the problems that we created, and that's how we would fix them. And now we're ready to go to the CNC machine and cut all of this out. So let's go back. Let's wind this up. This concludes, actually, the CabWriter Comprehensive 3 series of videos. And I hope you've learned something. I hope this gives you a really good feel of how to use CabWriter to model cabinets and to produce your production documentation and to cut them on CNC machines if that's what you intend to do. So until the next video, have a good day.